Okay, great. So thank you for having me. I'm going to be discussing, as Marianne just said, long-term land use and land cover patterns in Africa, and I will be focusing on the Holocene, which is primarily over the past 12,000 years or so, but some of the reconstructions will go back around 20,000 years. Oh. Okay. So the two main publications that just recently came out, they're kind of sister publications with one another, focus on these land cover and land use changes, primarily referring to forest and grassy biomes. So grassy biomes are including savanna and grasslands. And the idea here is to apply a very similar set of methods between these two approaches in order to reconstruct more continuous reconstructions, both spatially and temporally. So I'll explain what I mean by that as I move into the methods section. So I think the majority of you will have seen many of these images, most of them negative, about the kinds of impacts that we as humans can have on the Earth system. For example, a recent UN report put forward that 1 million species are thought to face extinction. We've known for decades that human land use is a primary driver of biodiversity change, and there are numerous land use and land cover change articles that reflect our increasing dominance over different Earth system processes. But we miss a lot of the nuance in the human-environment relationship when we have this kind of very modern and very kind of negative view. So when we're looking at landscapes today, we're often seeing very complex interactions between humans and their environments that can take place over hundreds to thousands of years. And these have a lot of different ecological and evolutionary effects on the landscapes. So if we want to be able to accurately model land cover as we move into increasingly uncertain conditions, then we really need to be able to understand this kind of long-term perspective. So this is typically a discipline referred to as historical ecology. And this allows us to look into these long-term impacts of human land use. And when I say impacts, that's not necessarily always a negative term. It can be positive and negative. So there was a recent publication that came out that demonstrates some of the different types of paleo records that can be used to look into changing land use and land cover change. So these include paleoclimatological studies, so isotopes from cave deposits. We have pollen cores, so sediment cores that come up from the bottom of lakes. And these hold all kinds of different information about climate change, vegetation change, also changes in human land use. So it gives us an idea as well about changes in fire regimes. Archaeology is a very good source of information about the way that people have used past landscapes, especially when we look at things like archaeobotanical information, which tells us about how past communities have modified plants. So one of the main things that humans have done to modify ecosystems through time includes the origin and the spread of agriculture. So here are just a few examples of domesticated plants and animals. So these include things like wheat, sorghum, and rice. And there are many other crops and domesticated animals, but these are some of the most common ones. So there's cattle, dogs, and rats. So a lot of the work that I've personally focused on has to do with reconstructing animal production, which involves many different domesticated animals. But since I'm focusing on Africa in particular, this will include a subset of those domestic animals. So why do we care about domestic animal production? Well, it's the most extensive form of used land globally. So it covers more than 25% of Earth's terrestrial land surface. It supports more than 40% of agricultural output, and it supports more than 1 billion livelihoods. So it's a big deal, and it is likely to affect ecosystems in varying but very broad manner. Okay, so a lot of this work focuses on understanding changes in grassy biomes that are associated with the development of animal production. The reason for that is that grassy biomes also cover a huge portion of Earth's land surface, more than 30%. And they are particularly extensive in Africa. So this is partly why I'm focusing on these two aspects of land use and land cover change in Africa. So in grassy biomes, we have drivers of change, which we refer to as disturbance dynamics, which are the drivers of change that happen outside of climate. So let me explain a little bit what I mean here. So to start with climate, we do have these long-term fluctuations in climate. I don't know how familiar you are with these, but we have slight changes in Earth's orbit around the sun, which changes the amount of insolation or solar radiation that's reaching Earth's atmosphere. And in the process, that's changing it's causing all kinds of fluctuations in the Earth system, including changes in the distribution and amount of precipitation. So in Africa, on the bottom, you have this kind of blue record. This is a leaf wax record that's reconstructing precipitation. And you can see that in the kind of heightened insolation, we have this period, which we refer to as the African humid period. So what happened at this point is that precipitation was spreading further north in Africa, and it caused this time, sometimes referred to as the Green Sahara, where certain plant species were able to travel further north with heightened humid conditions. Outside of these climate changes, though, we have many other drivers of change that are affecting vegetation cover, especially at the forest-savanna boundary. These can be both natural and anthropogenic, so it can be very difficult to disentangle these and understand which is causing land cover change in any given time and place. Some of those disturbance dynamics include fire. So changes in fire regimes can be caused by both natural and anthropogenic drivers. We also have changes in carbon dioxide, which promote woody recruitment. So grasslands would have evolved under fairly low CO2 conditions. And so as CO2 increases, this is promoting woody growth. So we know that CO2 has increased massively in recent times, especially since the Industrial Revolution, but we also have an increase that has been occurring over the past several thousand years. And there's kind of ongoing questions about whether or not changes in human agriculture could have potentially contributed to that early increase in CO2. We don't know, but it's kind of an outstanding question. We also have the impacts of just wild herbivores in their own right. So grazers, foragers, and browsers, these all affect land cover change on their own. And then we, as humans, we can also affect those communities and affect their environments, and this can have further knock-on effects or feedbacks on what's happening with land cover. And then, of course, again, I focus on reconstructing changes in animal production or animal husbandry. But this is something that we don't understand very well. It's been very extensive and like a major force that's occurred over thousands of years, but we have a very poor understanding of how this has actually caused any kind of vegetation change, how it's interacted with environments on long timescales. So the two types of information that I focus on using to do these reconstructions include faunal remains or animal bones from archaeological records. These are existing sets of data that come from many different excavations. And I'm also using pollen records, which come from these sediment cores that get pulled up from the bottom of lakes. So the same deal here, it's decades of research that go into these reconstructions. So when we look at these kinds of information in tandem with one another, we can get a better idea of these concurrent changes in land use and land cover. We can uncover a lot of complexity behind what's going on with human land use, and we can get more at this nuance in the relationship. So it's not just about degradation, it's at least as much about construction. And we start to see that when we look at this sort of bigger picture. And if we want to be able to produce sustainable land management strategies, we really need to be able to understand how these interactions have occurred over long time periods. So if we understand how past humans have adapted to changes in their environments and what kinds of effects that has had in turn, then we can be in a much better place to understand change as we move into increasingly uncertain environmental conditions. There are existing anthropogenic land cover change data sets that try to estimate the distribution of past human land use. The issue with these is that they don't do a great job of reflecting the evidence we have for land use in the past. So this is one of the most common ones that's used. If you look at Africa here, it's completely bare. So they're suggesting that there's been no pasture or rangeland 5,000 years ago or earlier. But if we look at faunal remains from archaeological records, we can see that this is just not true. For thousands of years before this, there has been evidence of animal production in Northern Africa. So in trying to address this and improve land use and land cover change reconstructions, the kind of information that we are interested in is we need geolocated site information. That has to then be associated with radiocarbon dates, which tell us when and where things happened. We also have taxa identification, so which types of animal, whether it's a domestic animal or a wild terrestrial ungulate, for example. And then we have the number of individual specimens. So for faunal remains, if we have 5 cow bones, the NISP would be 5. And for pollen, we have a pollen count, so the relative amounts of different kinds of pollen. The kinds of methods that we're using to do these reconstructions are coming from ecological niche modeling or species distribution modeling. So they've been adapted to this long-term context. But what we have are occurrence records to start off. And in this case of the land use reconstruction, we're looking at these faunal remains. So for example, here the red dots are domestic fauna. So any occurrence of where archaeologists have found domestic faunal remains. And then we also have examples of wild terrestrial ungulates as a test, but I won't go too much into that part here. We have to associate those occurrence records with climate information so that we can understand which climates people were using in the past and how that's changed through time. The kinds of climate information that I've used here comes from modeled paleoclimate simulation called Trace21K. And we have multiple different climate variables that can explain the distribution of any species. So we choose whichever of those variables is most appropriate. And then we need to plot those on 2 axes. I won't go too much into the technicalities here, but we do a principal component analysis, which essentially allows us to explain the majority of variance across these different climate variables so that we can then reconstruct this realized climatic niche. I'm going to be talking quite a bit about the climatic niche and climate space. And if you're not familiar with this side of things, it can get a bit ambiguous. So I'm just going to give you a quick background what I'm talking about when I say climate space and the climatic niche. So there's this kind of very fundamental niche theory where if you have an organism, there are different climatic spaces where this organism can actually live. Say, for example, right now, there are specific examples where this cow could live. And this could be anywhere in the universe that this cow could actually survive. But usually that is limited to a certain climate space. So for example, planet Earth would be a reasonable limitation. And in my case, I'm focusing on continental Africa. So when we look at the crossover between these two things, we get the potential niche, which is all of these spaces where this cow could exist in climate space that is actually available to it. This is further limited though, by different biotic and dispersal limitations. So there are many different kinds of these, but I'll give you one example. So when cattle first arrived in Northern Africa, when cattle, sheep, and goat all arrived in North Africa, it took thousands of years for them to spread southward over the continent. And it's been hypothesized that the reason for this is because there was a limitation that involved tsetse flies. So these would have carried a certain kind of disease, trypanosomiasis, which would have killed these animals as they tried to travel south. It would have also affected human communities. But basically these animals would need to either develop an evolutionary tolerance, so trypanotolerance, or there would need to be changes in vegetation cover that allow them to travel further south. So the realized niche are these climatic conditions where we've actually observed a species to exist. It doesn't necessarily mean it couldn't exist in other places. But that's what we're really reconstructing when we're looking at the realized climatic niche. So there are many different things that we can do with these realized climatic niches. The first one is that we can project them into geographic space or map them. So here's an example of what that would look like for the animal production niche. So what we're seeing here are changes in the available climates to these animals that's driven by the data in the archaeological record. So you can see this kind of north-south trend. You'll see some kind of like red area at the beginning in the southern bit. That means that area is suitable for these animals, but they can't actually travel down there because there are dispersal limitations that are preventing them from doing that. So The other thing that we can do with these realized climatic niches, which is very useful, is to quantify changes through time. And when we do that, we use niche metrics to do that, but it gives us a trend. So we're looking at changes in the niche breadth. This means it's essentially measuring how much of the African climate space is occupied by domestic animals at any one point in time. So we have two different metrics for doing that. I won't go into that too much right now, but we have a binary measurement that just says they're here or they're not. And we have a density-based measurement, which takes into account much more the abundance of these domestic animals. So when we reconstruct that trend for the domestic animal niche, we see that it's been expanding significantly through time. What this means is that people are basically modifying their land use strategies in order to move into increasingly new climatic conditions. And this is an example of what we refer to as niche construction. So when I'm talking about niche construction, this is, I don't know how familiar you are with this concept, this niche construction theory, but an organism is able to modify its own environment, and in the process, it can modify the niche of other organisms. So there are a number of different organisms that can do this, but humans are one of the best well-known example because we have an exceptional ability to modify our environments. And one of the one of the most prolific ways that we've done this is through the development of agriculture. So domestication isn't just this process that suddenly happens as an event. It occurs over thousands of years and involves all kinds of ecological, evolutionary, and socio-cultural change. To give you some examples of what kinds of evolutionary changes are happening, we have changing genetic signatures of, for example, African cattle. So as animals were spreading north to south, we get these genetic signatures that change relative to that. There was also a later introduction of a new kind of cattle, zebu, that came from east to west, and we can see that also reflected in the genetics. And perhaps one of the most interesting changes that happened around this time was the development of lactase persistence in people. So as domestic animals were spreading across the continent, people were developing an ability to digest milk products in association with that. Here's another more like environmental example of how niche construction can work. So here in these pastoral Neolithic sites in southern Kenya, through domestic animal production, there were dung deposits in this area, and this allowed a kind of high nutrient legacy to happen. So it was enriching the grasslands, and it would have attracted people to keep coming back to keep using that land for grazing in the future. So it's this kind of positive feedback cycle where people were modifying the environment and it made it more attractive to them in the future. So in the studies that I'm presenting, what are we really doing? So we're quantifying basically the ecological effects of these niche construction processes. So we're measuring the changes in the climatic envelope, how it changes as a result of all of these different sociocultural evolutionary processes that work together. There are many methodological benefits to these kinds of methods. They can improve land use mapping by providing more continuous in both space and time reconstructions. And they allow us also to quantify change, which in this case is very useful because it allows us to make comparisons directly between land use and land cover. So things that might not normally be directly comparable, we can put them into a sphere where they are comparable to one another. So onto the land cover portion of this, this focuses on forest and grassy biomes. And the reason we focus on these two is because we're interested in the effects of disturbance dynamics. And these dynamics affect the forest savanna boundary. They affect the amount, the distributions of forest, savanna, and grasslands. So in order to do these reconstructions, this is the part that relies on pollen information. So we had to do some pre-processing with this before we can move on to the very similar methods that I already showed you. We need to group these into plant functional types. So these are basically a kind of version of a biome. So species that are very likely to occur in forests, but not other vegetation types would be in the forest group, and so on. This would be for each group. We then calculate the relative percentages of each of these groups through time. And we have to use age depth models to reconstruct changes in the time when these pollen percentages are changing. And then after we've done all of this pre-processing, then we can move on to the methods that I've already showed you, In this case, I'm going to refer to it as a climatic envelope instead of a climatic niche, and that's just because we have many different types of plants grouped together in this case. So same story as before, but the occurrence records this time, instead of being the domestic animal remains, are these subfossil pollen records. So we take the occurrence records, we associate that with climatic information, and we reconstruct the climatic envelopes separately of forest and grassy biomes. And then we can do the same things with them as before. The first thing that we can do is map them. And this is useful because it shows us the sort of general trends, how these different types of vegetation have changed through time. On the left, you'll also see a map of sampling coverage, and this can give us a good idea of where we should and shouldn't be trusting these reconstructions. So the blue areas are places where these climates are well sampled, and the red areas are places where we don't have very good sampling. So we need to be wary of places where we don't have very much information. So for forests, for example, you can see that there's this kind of, especially from around 14,000 years ago, you can see that these taxa start to move northward. And this is happening with that increasing insolation trend. So precipitation is moving further northward, it's bringing vegetation with it, and then eventually it starts to contract again. The contraction happens in a bit of a different way, and I'm gonna explain that as I move on to the quantification sections. Grassy biomes are doing something very different, and I will also explain that in the next section. So when we quantified changes in these climatic envelopes, we found three main kind of nonlinear responses to insolation change. So nonlinear responses to the sort of general climate forcing. The first one was that we observed a forest hysteresis. And what we mean by this is that as insolation was increasing from 20,000 to 10,000 years ago, we had an expansion of forest associated with that. As insolation decreased, we had a much slower contraction of forest on the other side. So why this is, we don't know, but it could be, for example, because of these different disturbance dynamics. So for example, if CO2 levels are rising, this could promote woody growth. We don't know, but it's the kind of thing that we need to better understand. The second nonlinear response that we observed was a divergence in the extent of forest and grassy biomes. So as insolation was increasing, we had the expansion of both of them in a very similar manner, but as insolation then started to decrease, we got divergent trends. So forests decreased, but grassy biomes continued expanding onward. And I'm gonna get into some of the changes in land use that were happening at that same time. The third nonlinear response that we observed has to do with the climatic overlap between forest and grassy biomes. So this is the shared spaces for forest and grassy biomes. We have two different measurements here, and they're saying very different things. So I'm just going to give you a kind of overview of what this means. So the overlap between these is quite high, which means that they're sharing similar climatic spaces. But when we look at the density of forest and grassy biomes, we start to see something very different. And that is that the overlap in density between forest and grassy biomes is significantly decreasing through time. But then once insolation starts to go down, instead of rising back up again, it follows a completely new trend. It stays very low and kind of stable. So the idea here is that this could represent a change to what we refer to as stable alternative states, where when you have one climate, it can actually support different types of vegetation in the same climate. And that is, again, because of these disturbance dynamics that can act in the same climatic spaces. So this raises questions about what kinds of disturbance dynamics could have been causing these trends, or if there's just another driver that is not apparent here. So to give you a general overview of this, in relation to human land use, again, we have this expansion in all of the niches leading up to the thermal maximum. But as we move away, that's when we start getting this divergence between forest and grassy biomes. And this is, if we think about this in terms of animal production, this is around the same time that animals start to arrive and expand on the continent. And this raises questions about, could animal production have affected the expansion of grassy biomes? Or oppositely, could it just be that it became more habitable for these animals and they could spread further across the continent? So we started getting these kind of divergent responses around this time. And forests even started increasing during this African humid period termination, which is interesting because there was actually a slight increase in precipitation at this time, which is a bit counterintuitive because this is when the humid period is ending. So we needed to look into this a little bit further, and we did that by including more types of taxa in our analyses. When we did that, what we found was that there was this sudden contraction in forest species and a sudden expansion of savanna species. So this is a period that's often referred to as the first phase of the Central African forest crisis, and typically it's attributed to climate alone. But the concurrence of these different events together raises new questions about, could there be a role that the spread of animal production was playing in these vegetation changes at this time? We don't know, but these are the kinds of questions, very complex questions that get brought up when we do these kinds of reconstructions. I can't really see the side anymore, but forest continues to go down after that, and grassy biomes then in both density and extent just keep increasing. So there's a very clear trend here, and it's obviously associated with the expansion of the animal production niche. So we get, we're getting increases in the number of domestic animal sites, the number of remains, the niche is expanding, and that's happening throughout this period. But especially when we get the expansion of both the extent and density, we've got a lot of other types of change going on at this time as well. We have the expansion of cultivation as well. We have many different population expansions, the development of pyrotechnologies, land clearance, all of these things that could also be contributing to the expansion of grassy biomes. So there's a lot of different variables at play here. So it's a kind of complex thing that we can't come to any quick conclusions about, that it requires a lot more investigation. Now, I've only presented just the presence and the distribution of different domestic animal species, but there's a whole other suite of details about land use that we need to understand in order to understand these human environment relationships. So this can vary from the type of production strategy people are using, to the type of animal they're using, to the feeding relationship that's taking place. So if you're interested in that, you can feel free to take a further look at this article. And the current work that I'm focusing on, I won't go into detail on that, but it's making comparisons between these reconstructions I've just showed you in continental Africa and Madagascar. And the reason that I'm doing that is because agriculture didn't arrive in Madagascar until just over, like a little bit further back than 1,000 years ago, around 1,200 years ago. So it provides a really good comparison for us to look into changes in grassy biomes and whether or not this expansion does actually happen after the introduction of agriculture, or if it's something that's occurring as a result of other drivers of change. So if you're interested in that, feel free to ask some questions about that as well. I have some slides. But yeah, that brings me to the end. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy now to take any questions.
Thank you, Leanne. That was very interesting. So it's some of these techniques I've never seen before, so that's quite interesting to learn about. So it's a niche construction. That's a new thing for me. Any question, guys and girls? You can either put it in the chat box on the bottom, or you can raise your hands if you want to ask a question directly. So I'm monitoring your.
Hi, I've got one out.
Go ahead.
In the slide that you mentioned about the insulation, I think it was about something to do with the Earth's axis or the revolution around the sun. That actually was quite interesting. If you could just shed more light upon that, and what exactly is that you explained? If you could just repeat that.
Yeah, I have a slide hopefully here that
that one, the one which was right now.
I have another slide that I can show you that explains some of those. We refer to it as orbital forcing. Right, so there are, here's a really nice diagram that shows these different processes that happen. So we have orbital forcing, which is these Milankovitch cycles. Right. And so there are these periodic changes in the way that Earth is orbiting the sun. So we have changes in eccentricity, which is the shape of Earth's orbit around the sun. We also have this kind of what they refer to as axial precession. It's this kind of Earth is wobbling on its axis. We also have changes in the tilt or the obliquity. These all happen on different timescales, but they're causing these natural fluctuations in the amount of solar radiation that's reaching all the different parts of Earth's surface. And so when we reconstruct that, you can see that changes in greenhouse gases like methane or carbon dioxide, these follow natural cycles. They do deviate quite a bit, as you can see. So the dashed line is insolation. So you've got these kind of periodic cycles. And then the dark black line, the thick black line, in this case is methane. So you can see that it does follow these cycles and it deviates a bit, but especially in recent times, we have this deviation both in terms of methane and carbon dioxide. And most people know this since the Industrial Revolution, but we also have these much earlier increases in methane and carbon dioxide that occurred over the past several thousand years. So there are some kind of ongoing questions about if that could be a result of certain human land uses, or if it's just another driver that we don't really understand very well. But these orbital forcing cycles, they certainly don't explain the kind of recent rapid warming that we have, especially since the Industrial Revolution, through greenhouse gas emissions. And so, yeah, this leads people to term the Anthropocene as the current time, but there's a lot of debate about when that should actually start because of the complexity between these different cycles and just the fact that we don't really understand what effects humans have actually had in the past.
So in this case, can we say that most of this could be because of the human actions, or we don't have enough evidence as of now to say it, or can we establish that?
You mean like what I've presented here, or?
No, I mean as in this change of eccentricity and the changes that we explained in terms of.
So these are just natural cycles that happen as a result of the different ways that Earth is orbiting the sun. So all of this is outside of our control. It's just these more recent deviations outside of these natural cycles that leave us with questions about if we're affecting these cycles. We really don't know when it starts. Obviously, we know for recent times, but yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Thank you, Leanne. I do like your animations. I wish I could do that.
I didn't make this one. This is from someone from NASA. Yeah.
Yeah, very impressive.
Yeah, it's nice. It's very nice.
But also the other one's very nice.
Oh, yeah.
Any other questions? If no one comes straight away, I do have one.
I have one as well.
There you go, Eleanor. Go for it.
I was just wondering if, or maybe there isn't, but if there are any implications of how domestic animals are now being used in Africa, and the implications this has on land use that you can take from your research.
Yeah, so I think there are many different implications that we could take from this. It's very kind of broad. But if we have a better understanding of how, well, I'll start with, in recent times, local communities who are using the land tend to get a lot of blame and demonization for land degradation. And if we can have a better understanding of how people have, so we know people affect landscapes, but if we better understand the ways that people have affected landscapes, then we can give better attribution to how that's happening, rather than just assuming that people are degrading landscapes all the time in recent times. So it's very easy to see a land use next to what we might think of as a degraded area. For example, with deforestation. Deforestation has very complex causes, and it's very easy for people to assume that people have caused that deforestation. So you see deforestation, you assume it's people. And of course, this is happening in many places, but we also have other dynamics, other disturbance dynamics that are at play. So for example, forest savanna boundaries, we have these kind of natural mosaics that are occurring in many places for thousands of years before this time. So it's not necessarily you look at a landscape and you see a mosaic, and a lot of people assume that this is a kind of degraded forest, that people have caused this to happen. But actually these places have huge amounts of biodiversity, and they cover huge portions of the earth. So it's really important that we have an understanding of the other processes that have caused those formations of vegetation, and truly what is the role of people. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that was very good. Thank you. It's
Okay.
really interesting.
I mean, this will have huge implications also for like where you plan your restoration interventions, right?
Exactly.
Targeting landscapes very naturally, like where you would have natural grassland, would probably be not very wise decision to do.
Yeah, exactly.
There have been a couple of questions coming up. I start at the top. What's your favorite part of the research?
So my favorite part is probably just like making a bunch of different maps of things. That's really fun. It's really fun to just see how, when you're able to visualize how things are changing, it's really nice to just, you learn things that you don't even really think to ask. So that's probably my favorite part. And I'm still doing that now, just in Madagascar. So yeah.
I'm in it for the maps too.
Yeah, I think people usually like the maps. Yeah.
There's a couple more. The access to papers. The best thing is I will just Leanne has a website, so look up her website. She will list all her papers there, I presume, and then you can just look for the papers if you want the full details, or if you have a slide somewhere.
I don't have a slide with the exact references, but I could send those to you afterwards. They're all open access, so you should be able to
Nice.
to get them. Yeah, I'll send those after.
Thank you. And then there is a question on, will the study in Madagascar be used to compare the results that you gathered on the continent?
Sorry, could you repeat? It cut out.
So it's a new study that you have that you're starting in Madagascar. Will you compare it to what you have found for the continent?
Yeah. So I won't go into. Won't try to take up too much time there. But in Madagascar, as we were just discussing, there are all of these issues surrounding. We know there's been a lot of deforestation in recent times, but it's really difficult to measure the extent of that deforestation because we don't have a good understanding of how extensive grassy biomes were in the past, prior to human introductions in the development of the spread of agriculture, excuse me. So yeah, a lot of the work I'm doing now is looking into what these early impacts could have been on grassy biomes, if anything. And how extensive were these early grassy biomes? Because we know that they existed. We know that they're ancient, which I can show. Yeah, so it's an animation, so it's not great here. But yeah, so here's some articles that show that we know that they are millions of years old. And so this is something that we've just documented there's a upcoming chapter in the Natural History of Madagascar, which just overviews the endemicity of all of these different grassy biomes. And so people tend to assume that the whole island, almost the whole island, could have been forested at some point, but given all of this biodiversity in grasslands, that's very unlikely. And so the idea is for me to look at where these grassy biomes were distributed in the past. And there's all kinds of different information that we can look at to understand that. So isotopic information is one way. So for example, if you have animal remains, so in Madagascar, there were these pygmy hippos, giant tortoises that existed in the past. And these animals could have been opening up grasslands prior to people. So that's the kind of thing that we can understand. If we take isotopic information from their bones, it can tell us what they were eating. And this can give us some clues as to what the past vegetation was actually like. Does that answer? I don't know.
I got it answered.
Okay.
When did the first people, I presume that Madagascar was actually inhabited by people since a long time.
So that's a really hot topic actually in Madagascar. It's like one of the most elusive islands in terms of that we don't have a great understanding of when people arrived and how they distributed themselves. So it was assumed that people actually didn't arrive until 2,300 years ago, until very recently. So there's been some recent work that's coming out, which I can show you one example of that here. So there's been new evidence that completely changes our understanding of the arrival of people in Madagascar. So this is a giant elephant bird. Can you see this? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. The giant elephant bird from this publication was found 10,000 years ago. And there are cut marks on these bones. And so this is, you know, quite convincing evidence of early hunter-gatherers in the region. So we have all this new evidence that is very interesting. We have some other, there's some other work that's been done. They found stone tools from around 4,000 years ago. So it's clear that there's some other stuff going on earlier on. But agriculture didn't arrive until around 1,200 years ago. So that's, for me, I mean, hunting and gathering can certainly affect landscapes, but I'm personally interested more in the effects of agriculture on land cover change.
And did the agricultural expansion, do you have an idea on why it started so late? Were the resource needs just met by doing hunting, gathering? And then they weren't anymore? Or?
I mean, I personally don't really know why it started so late. I would just assume it's a combination of that's just when like crops and animals started to arrive, and there are many different factors that influence that. But we do have, if you're interested in that, there's some research that's showing, so I don't know, you can see like the tip of Madagascar here. This is showing when the first cultivated plants arrived in Madagascar. So there's all different trajectories of crops and animals coming in. So it's you know, a discipline in itself to understand multiple disciplines to understand these things. But yeah, that's the basic idea.
Very cool. And what does an elephant bird? I've never heard about an elephant bird neither.
Yeah. So
when did that go extinct then?
Yeah, it went extinct. So it's, yeah, giant elephant bird. I think there were 3 different kinds. Don't quote me on that. There were different species of them, and we don't have a great idea of like what kinds of vegetation they were eating. But if we look at isotopes of their bones, that can give us some idea of what their diets were. And I know someone's looking into that right now.
Cool.
Yeah, so
exciting.
Yeah.
I have another question from a student, and they asked, is there research or evidence of the same being found elsewhere in the world? I presume maybe South America, so outside Africa.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so in South America, I mean, I don't focus on South America at all, but there are plenty of papers that look into these kinds of topics about savannas in South America and how these relate to changes in other places. So there's a lot of research that has been done on this, and I'm not going to even really try to answer that because I don't understand it very well. But there have certainly been these kind of early megafaunal extinctions throughout the world that raise similar questions across savannas across the world. So the current work that I'm doing is looking into remote sensing information. So I'll be able to kind of look at that through, do I have time to give you a little, it should be.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Let me just find that. There we go. Okay. So what I'm currently doing is trying to define the different kind of climatic vegetation and fire regions in Madagascar. So I'm doing that using, this is Climate Information, World Clim, or CHELSA. I'm using both. And I'm basically just trying to characterize Madagascar's climate, clustering it into these different regions. And then something we can do is project that to similar spaces, similar climatic spaces across the globe. And then we can make comparisons between these similar climate spaces to see if, like, what the similarities and differences are between vegetation and fire regimes. So for vegetation, we're looking at remotely sensed NDVI, which is basically the greenness of the vegetation. So we take all different kinds of characteristics of NDVI, and we also look at fire regimes. So how big the fires are, how frequently they're occurring, what the season length of the fires is. So if we compare fire regimes and vegetation regime season length, this can give us an idea of whether humans are starting fires or whether they're natural fires, in climate induced. So yeah, these are kinds of interesting questions we can address between savannas in different areas.
Yeah, nice. I've seen it. So there is Australia involved. Is there any savanna type of vegetation in Southeast Asia?
So here,
I couldn't quite see it.
yes.
Yeah. Oh yeah, further north. Okay.
Yeah, so I work with someone who is very, very knowledgeable about Australia. For me, it's similar to South America, where I don't know any specifics about it. But yeah, definitely there are some very relevant regions that match this kind of the orange climate cluster from northwestern Madagascar.
Oh, nice. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Any more questions, people? I only see one here that says, thank you for the fascinating talk. And then the slides, whether you would be happy to share the slides with the students or not.
I can share the slides. Yep.
And then I will just upload it to Canvas. Just a question, because it is a recording. Can I upload it to the web pages?
Yeah,
because I've started to create that web page now.
Yeah.
slowly. But yeah, it will be good. I think it's quite exciting, this kind of research.
Yeah. I'm excited about it.
Very cool. Well, that's all the questions from us. With that, I guess we finish.
Great.
So thank you very much again, Leanne, and goodbye, everyone. Maybe stay here until everyone leaves.
Okay.
I had Megan last week. Was it last week? Everything's blends together, and she suddenly went with all the students. It's like, how is she gonna? Yeah, that's very interesting. I know. Is it Colin Mustafi?
Courtney Mustafi? Yeah.
And I remember that I sat on the airplane with him and I asked him, well, that's really nice that you look at the past, but what does that tell us about the future in terms of management, man?
Yeah. No, it's, I know, Colin's a good friend.
Yeah.
I mean, I personally think it's very useful, but I think we're only just now kind of starting to get that into a format where we can really kind of, address the questions that you're asking. So it's like, I think archaeologists and paleoecologists have always known that's the case, but it can be a bit ambiguous of how we actually apply that to modern problems.